The gavel slammed down, the crack echoing in the cavernous courtroom like a rifle shot. But it wasn't my hand on the gavel, not this time. I was in the defendant's chair, my knuckles white on the polished wood, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Across the room, a woman named Carol, with a face like a clenched fist and hair the color of rust, smirked at me. She was the president of our HOA, the self-proclaimed queen of our little suburban kingdom, and she had just, with a perjured testimony and a forged document, convinced a judge to grant an emergency eviction order. My house, the one my grandfather built with his own 2 hands, the one that smelled of sawdust and old books and 30 years of my life, was no longer mine. The police officer at my side cleared his throat, a sound of polite professional pity. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "we need to go." But I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at Carol, and in that moment, as she mouthed the words, "You're finished," I made a promise to myself. She had started a war. I was going to finish it. Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far HOA power reaches. It had all started, as most suburban wars do, with something small, something green. My lawn. Not the manicured, chemically treated, pudding green perfect lawn that Carol and her HOA cronies demanded, but my wild, unruly, clover and dandelion-strewn patch of nature. I liked it that way. It was a little rebellion, a middle finger to the beige conformity of the neighborhood. And for a while, it was a rebellion that went unnoticed. Until Carol. She'd moved in the year before, a whirlwind of nervous energy and brittle smiles. Her husband was a developer, a man who paved over paradise and put up parking lots, and Carol, it seemed, had absorbed his love of control, of neat lines and sterile landscapes. She saw my lawn not as a personal choice, but as a personal affront. Her first move was a letter, a passive-aggressive masterpiece of corporate speak and veiled threats. "It has come to our attention," it began, "that the property at 12 Oak Street is not in compliance with community standards." It went on to cite a bylaw I'd never heard of, something about maintaining a uniform and aesthetically pleasing appearance. The letter was printed on expensive cream-colored paper, the HOA logo embossed in gold at the top. It felt less like a neighborly request and more like a royal decree. The air that day was thick with the smell of freshly cut grass from next door, a scent that had always meant summer and freedom, but now felt like an accusation. I ignored it. A week later, another letter arrived, this one with a photograph of my lawn, a red circle drawn around a particularly cheerful-looking dandelion. This time, there was a fine. $50. I laughed. $50 for a weed. It was absurd. I threw the letter in the trash, along with the pizza flyers and credit card offers. I had bigger things to worry about. My daughter was starting. College in the fall. A fact that filled me with a terrifying mix of pride and panic. The roof needed replacing, a job that was going to cost more than a lifetime of dandelion fines. And I was still grieving. My husband, a man who had loved my wild lawn as much as I did, had passed away 2 years earlier. The dandelions, in a way, were for him. He'd always said they were a sign of a healthy ecosystem, a reminder that nature couldn't be tamed, no matter how many rules you threw at it. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love this ending. Stick with me. The letters kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. The fines doubled, then tripled. Carol, it turned out, was not a woman who liked to be ignored. I started seeing her everywhere. Her silver SUV would crawl past my house, her face a mask of disapproval behind the tinted glass. I'd be in my garden, my hands in the dirt, and I'd look up to see her standing on her porch, staring at me, her arms crossed over her chest. The air would crackle with a tension that was almost palpable, thick and heavy like the summer humidity. She never said a word, but her message was clear. You don't belong here. One morning, I woke up to a new sign on my lawn. It was a garish, Bright yellow sign, the kind you see in front of houses that have been foreclosed on. It read, in big black letters, "This property is in violation of HOA covenants." I felt a hot flush of anger creep up my neck. This was no longer about dandelions. This was about humiliation. This was about power. And I, a woman who had spent the last 20 years as a high school history teacher, a woman who had taught generations of kids about the dangers of unchecked power, was not about to be bullied into submission by a woman who thought she was the queen of the cul-de-sac. That afternoon, I went to the library. Not the local branch, with its apathetic teenagers and sticky tables, but the county law library, a place that smelled of old paper and quiet determination. I spent hours poring over HOA case law, my fingers tracing the lines of legal precedent, the words blurring together until my head ached. I learned about selective enforcement, about harassment, about the fiduciary duty of an HOA board, and then I found it. A little-known state statute, buried deep in the property code, that said an HOA could not enforce a bylaw if it had been consistently ignored for a period of 5 years or more. A waiver of enforcement. And I knew, with a certainty that settled, deep in my bones, that the dandelion bylaw, if it even existed, had been ignored for far longer than that. My neighbor on the left had a garden full of wildflowers. The guy on the right had a lawn that was more moss than grass. Carol had picked a fight with the wrong woman. This wasn't just my fight, it's yours too. Tell me if your HOA has ever crossed the line. Armed with my newfound knowledge, I went to the next HOA meeting. It was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile beige room that smelled of stale coffee and self-importance. Carol was at the head of the table, a gavel in her hand, a smug look on her face. She called the meeting to order, her voice a nasal drone that grated on my nerves. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, my heart pounding, a copy of the state statute in my hand. "Carol," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "I'm not paying your fines." I explained the law, my voice growing stronger with every word. I talked about the wildflowers and the moss, about the years of benign neglect. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something that looked a lot like fear. But then it was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. "That's an interesting interpretation of the law," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But our lawyers will have a different one." And then she did something I never expected. She opened a file and pulled out a photograph. It wasn't of my lawn. It was of my daughter, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, at a party, a red plastic cup in her hand. "Underage drinking is a serious offense," Carol said, her voice a silky threat. "It would be a shame if this got out." The room was silent. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, the frantic beat of my own heart. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was no longer about dandelions. This was about blackmail. What would you have done in my place? Drop it in the comments. The next few weeks were a living hell. The letters and fines continued, but now there was a new, more sinister element to Carol's campaign. My tires were slashed. My mailbox was vandalized. A dead squirrel was left on my doorstep. I called the police, but they were useless. "It's a civil matter," they said, their voices bored and dismissive. "You'll have to take it up with your HOA." I felt a growing sense of isolation, of being a prisoner in my own home. My neighbors, the same people, who had once brought me casseroles and offered to mow my lawn, now looked away when they saw me. They were afraid of Carol, afraid of what she would do to them if they took my side. The smell of fear was as thick as the summer air, a cloying, sweet scent of decay. I started documenting everything. I bought a security camera, a tiny, discreet thing that I hid in the branches of the oak tree in my front yard. I kept a log of every letter, every fine, every act of vandalism. I took pictures of the slashed tires, the graffiti on my mailbox, the dead squirrel. I was building a case, a fortress of evidence around myself. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. Carol had the HOA's lawyers on her side, a high-priced firm that specialized in crushing homeowners. I had a public library card and a growing sense of desperation. Ever dealt with an HOA bully? Let's see how many of us there are. One evening, I was sitting on my porch watching the fireflies dance in the twilight when a car pulled into my driveway. It was an old, beat-up pickup truck, the kind you don't see in our neighborhood anymore. A man got out, a tall, wiry man with a kind face and a sad smile. It was Mr. Henderson, a retired plumber who had lived in the neighborhood since before it was a neighborhood, since it was just a patch of woods and a dirt road. "I saw what she did to your mailbox," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It ain't right." He told me about his wife, who had passed away a few years earlier. She had loved her garden, a riot of color and life that had been the envy of the neighborhood. But Carol had hated it. She had fined them, harassed them, made their lives a living hell until his wife, her spirit broken, had let the garden die. "She's a bully," he said, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw. "And the only way to beat a bully is to hit them where it hurts." He told me about the HOA's dirty little secret, the community well. It was an old well dug back in the 50s, and it was supposed to be for irrigation only. But the developer, Carol's husband, had cut a deal with the county to use it as a primary water source for his new subdivision, the one he was building on the other side of the woods. It was illegal, a clear violation of the county's water use regulations. But the developer had friends in high places, and the county had looked the other way. "If you can prove it," Mr. Henderson said, his eyes gleaming with a fierce light, "you can shut her down. You can shut them all down." The next day, I went to the county records office, a dusty, forgotten corner of the courthouse that smelled of mildew and bureaucracy. I spent the entire day there, my back aching, my eyes burning, sifting through old property records and water use permits. And then, just as the clerk was about to close, I found it. A handwritten note stapled to the back of a permit from 1958. It was a memo from the county engineer, warning that the well was unstable, that it was in danger of collapse. And at the bottom of the memo, a signature. The same signature that was on the eviction notice that had been taped to my door that morning. The signature of the judge who had, just hours earlier, ordered me out of my house. The same judge who, it turned out, had a financial stake in the developer's new subdivision. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a picture of corruption so vast, so audacious, that it took my breath away. If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type yes so we can get this trending. I walked out of the records office and into the late afternoon sun, the memo clutched in my hand. The air was hot and still, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue, but I felt a chill run down my spine. This was bigger than my lawn, bigger than my house. This was about a whole system of corruption, a web of lies and deceit that had ensnared my entire community, and I, a history teacher with a library card and a stubborn streak, was the only one who could untangle it. What they did next almost made me lose everything, but it also gave me the win of my life. I knew what I had to do. I went home and called the one person I knew I could trust, a former student of mine who was now a reporter for the local news. I told him everything. The lawn, the letters, the harassment, the blackmail, the well, the judge. He listened patiently, his silence punctuated by the occasional uh-huh and I see. When I was done, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "This is big," he said, his voice a low whistle. "Are you sure you want to do this? These people, they play for keeps." I thought of Mr. Henderson's wife, of her broken spirit and her dead garden. I thought of my daughter, of the fear in her eyes when I told her about Carol's threat. And I thought of my husband, of his love for our wild, unruly lawn, for the dandelions that were a symbol of everything that Carol and her kind were trying to destroy. "I'm sure," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I'm not just fighting for my house anymore. I'm fighting for my home." The next 60 seconds will show you exactly how a single document can destroy an entire HOA. The camera I'd hidden in the oak tree, the one I'd almost forgotten about, had captured something that would change everything. I rewound the footage, my heart in my throat, and then I saw it. A figure sneaking onto my property in the dead of night. A figure with a can of gasoline and a book of matches. A figure that looked a lot like Carol. If you thought they couldn't stoop lower, you're wrong, and this is where I got my payback. The image on the screen was grainy, shrouded in the ghostly green-black of night vision, but the malice was crystal clear. It was Carol. Her pinched bird-like features were distorted by the low resolution, but the stiff, self-important way she carried herself was unmistakable. I watched her creep across my lawn, her movements furtive and jagged. My stomach tightened as she unscrewed the cap on the gasoline can. The air in my study suddenly felt thin, tasting of dust and ozone from the computer monitor. I could almost smell the sharp chemical tang of the gasoline, could feel the phantom heat of the flame she intended to light. She doused the base of the ancient oak tree, my husband's favorite, its branches a dark canopy against the digital sky. For a moment, she just stood there, a silhouette of pure, distilled hatred. Then she fumbled with the matchbook, her hands shaking. And in that moment of hesitation, a car turned onto our street, its headlights sweeping across my property. Carol froze, a startled animal caught in the glare, before scurrying back into the shadows and disappearing. My breath came out in a ragged gasp. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It wasn't about dandelions or property values. This was attempted arson, attempted murder, for all I knew. I sat there for a long time, the only sound the frantic thumping of my own heart, the clip of Carol with the gas can playing on a silent, terrifying loop. I saved the file, backing it up to 3 different cloud services and a thumb drive I immediately hid in a hollowed-out copy of War and Peace. This was my ace in the hole, my silver bullet, but I couldn't use it, not yet. The footage was just blurry enough that her high-priced lawyers could argue it was inconclusive. They'd call it a prank, a misunderstanding. They'd paint me as the hysterical, grieving widow. No, I had to be smarter than that. This wasn't a skirmish I could win by firing a single shot. This was a siege, and I needed to dismantle her fortress, stone by stone, before she even knew she was under attack. What would you have done in my place? Drop it in the comments. The next morning, the war escalated. A tow truck dispatched by the HOA was hooking up my car. My 10-year-old sedan parked perfectly in my own driveway. I ran out, my bare feet stinging on the hot asphalt. "What are you doing?" I yelled, my voice hoarse with a mixture of sleep and fury. The driver, a beefy guy with a greasy ponytail, just shrugged and pointed to a freshly painted red line on the curb at the end of my driveway. It hadn't been there the night before. "Fire lane," he grunted, not meeting my eyes. "HOA says move it or lose it." It was a $100 fine to the HOA and another $200 to get my car back. It was Monday. On Tuesday, a certified letter arrived. A lien had been placed on my house for unpaid fines, thousands of dollars in accumulated, fabricated violations. The paper felt heavy in my hand, each word a lead weight on my chest. They were trying to bleed me dry, to make it impossible for me to fight back. The legalese was dense, designed to intimidate, to make you feel helpless. But buried in the jargon was a clause about contesting the lien in court and a deadline. 30 days. The clock was ticking. I could feel the walls closing in, the air thick with the smell of her cheap perfume that seemed to linger in the mail she sent. Wednesday was the smear campaign. I woke up to find my face plastered on flyers taped to every lamppost and mailbox in the neighborhood. It was a grainy photo, taken from a distance, of me talking to Mr. Henderson in my driveway. The headline screamed, "Is your neighbor plotting to poison our water?" The flyer, written in Carol's signature tone of sanctimonious panic, accused me of conspiring to contaminate the community well, of being a dangerous radical who wanted to destroy the neighborhood. It was libel. It was insane. But I saw the way people looked at me now, the suspicion in their eyes, the mothers who pulled their children a little closer when I walked past. Carol wasn't just trying to take my house. She was trying to take my name, my reputation, my community. Ever dealt with an HOA bully? Let's see how many of us there are. That night, there was a knock on my door. It was so soft I almost didn't hear it. I peeked through the peephole to see a small, stooped woman with flyaway gray hair and panicked eyes. It was Martha, the HOA treasurer. A retired accountant, she was usually a quiet, mousy woman who never spoke at meetings unless spoken to. I opened the door a crack. "Can I help you, Martha?" I asked, my voice wary. She clutched a thick manila envelope to her chest like a shield. I can't be a part of this anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What she's doing, it's not right. It's illegal." She thrust the envelope into my hands. "It's all in there," she said, her eyes darting nervously around my yard. "The financials. The real ones." And then she was gone, scurrying back into the darkness like a frightened mouse. I locked the door, my heart pounding, and tore open the envelope. The air in my living room was still and heavy, carrying the scent of the wilted flowers on my dining table. Inside were spreadsheets, bank statements, invoices. It was a roadmap of Carol's corruption. She was using HOA funds as her personal piggy bank. There were charges for lavish dinners, for designer clothes, for trips to the spa, all disguised as community maintenance and legal fees. She'd hired her husband's construction company at an inflated price to paint that ridiculous fire lane in front of my house. But the real bombshell was the insurance policy. Carol had taken out a massive policy on the community clubhouse and then hired a string of questionable contractors, all friends of her husband's, for renovations. The invoices were faked, the work was never done, and the insurance premiums were astronomical. She was setting the HOA up for a fall, planning to cash in when it all went bankrupt. This wasn't just about power, it was about greed. And it was. My next move. I knew I needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but someone who understood the murky, vicious world of HOA law. The problem was, I was broke. The lien, the towing fees, the constant draining stress of it all had wiped me out. I was sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by a mountain of bills and Martha's incriminating documents, the bitter taste of stale coffee on my tongue, when I remembered a conversation from years ago. My husband, a proud union man his whole life, had once told me about a pro bono legal service offered to teachers. A long shot, but it was the only one I had. I found him in a cramped, dusty office above a bail bondsman. His name was David Chen, a young, sharp-eyed lawyer who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He listened to my story, his face impassive, his fingers steepled under his chin. I laid it all out for him. The dandelions, the blackmail, the well, the judge, the grainy video of the arson attempt, the financials from Martha. I spread the documents. Across his desk, a paper trail of Carol's crimes. When I was finished, he was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the spreadsheets. The only sound was the faint wail of a siren in the street below. "They're trying to drown you in paper," he said finally. "It's a classic slap suit tactic. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. They bury you in legal fees and frivolous emotions until you give up." He tapped the lien notice with his finger. They think you'll fold, but they made a mistake." He leaned forward, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "They put it in writing." He pointed to the lien. "There's a legal doctrine called unclean hands. It's an equitable defense. It means that if a plaintiff, in this case the HOA, has acted unethically or in bad faith in relation to the subject of the complaint, they are not entitled to a remedy. You can't come into court asking for justice when you have blood on your own hands." He picked up one of the faked invoices from Martha's envelope. "And this," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is more than enough to get our own motion to dismiss. We're not just going to defend, we're going to attack." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope, a tiny, fragile flame in the suffocating darkness. I could smell the rain on the hot pavement outside his window, a clean scent that promised to wash away the grime. If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type yes so we can get this trending. Our first move was to file the motion to dismiss the lien, citing the unclean hands doctrine. We attached copies of the financials, the fake invoices, the whole sordid mess. It was a shot across the bow, a signal to Carol and her cronies that I was not going away. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. The next day, another flyer appeared. This one was even more vicious than the last. It accused me of embezzling. From the PTA when my daughter was in elementary school, a lie so absurd, so baseless, that it was almost laughable. But people believe what they want to believe, and Carol had primed them to believe the worst of me. The whispers followed me everywhere, the glares, the open hostility. I was a pariah in my own neighborhood. Carol called an emergency HOA meeting. Her goal was to have me publicly censured, to formally brand me as an enemy of the community. She wanted to use the weight of the collective to crush me. I walked into that clubhouse, the same beige, soulless room where she had blackmailed me weeks before, and the animosity was a physical force. It hit me like a wave, a wall of silent judgment. The air was thick with it, a sour, metallic smell. Carol stood at the podium, her face flushed with righteous fury. She laid out her case against me, a tapestry of lies and half-truths, her voice rising with theatrical indignation. She painted me as a monster, a threat to their children, their property values, their very way of life. My neighbors, people I had known for years, nodded along, their faces grim and unforgiving. When she was finished, there was a moment of silence. "Does the accused have anything to say?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock solemnity. I walked to the podium, my legs shaking, my hands clutching a single piece of paper. I looked out at the faces of my neighbors, at the fear and anger she had stoked in them. "I do," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "I have a question for our president." I turned to Carol. The HOA's financial records, which were so generously provided to me by a concerned board member, show that you paid your husband's company $10,000 to paint a fire lane. A fire lane that didn't exist until the day my car was towed. A fire lane that, according to the county fire marshal, is not, in fact, a fire lane at all. I let that hang in the air for a moment. A murmur went through the crowd. The records also show that you spent $5,000 of our money on a community outreach dinner at a restaurant that, according to my credit card statement, is the same restaurant where you celebrated your wedding anniversary. And then there's the matter of the insurance. But before I could finish, a man in the back stood up. It was Mr. Henderson. "She's right," he said, his voice booming through the room. "I've lived here for 40 years. That curb has never been a fire lane. It's a lie, just like everything else this woman says." Another voice piped up, a woman near the front. "My dues went up 30% last year. She said it was for landscaping. But the only new flowers I've seen are in the pots on her front porch." Suddenly the dam broke. The fear that Carol had cultivated for so long was replaced by a tide of anger. People were shouting, demanding answers. Where did the money go? Why were their dues so high? What was really going on? Carol's face went from flushed red to a pasty, sickly white. She banged her gavel, but no one was listening. Her power, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, was crumbling before her eyes. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a venomous hatred that chilled me to the bone. She knew she was losing control, and in that moment, she did something desperate. She played her last card. "She's a vindictive, unstable woman," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She threatened me. She threatened my family. She's the one who tried to burn her own house down for the insurance money." The accusation was so shocking, so audacious, that the room fell silent once again. The lie was a living thing in the room, sucking all the air out. My jaw dropped. I was speechless. She was twisting the narrative, using my own evidence against me before I could even present it. The next 60 seconds will show you exactly how a single document can destroy an entire HOA. My lawyer, David, had anticipated this. He'd told me she was a cornered rat, and cornered rats will do anything to survive. He stepped forward from the back of the room, where he'd been standing quietly, and placed a laptop on the table, facing the stunned crowd. "A funny thing about insurance fraud," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It requires you to actually file a claim." He clicked a key, and an email projected onto the screen behind him. It was an official communication from my insurance company. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that I had not filed any claim. In fact, I had called them the day after the incident to explicitly cancel the fire coverage on my policy. A collective gasp went through the room. Carol's jaw went slack. The camera crews, alerted by my reporter friend who had been waiting outside, burst through the doors, their lights flooding the room, their microphones eager to capture the implosion. If you thought they couldn't stoop lower, you're wrong. And this is where I got my payback. The flashbulbs were like a sudden, violent sunrise, bleaching the room of all color. For a frozen second, nobody moved. Carol stood at the podium, her mouth agape, her face a grotesque mask of shock. The reporters surged forward, a pack of wolves. Sensing a kill, their microphones extended like weapons. The air, which moments before had been thick with tension, now crackled with the electric hum of a full-blown media-feeding frenzy. The scent was a mixture of metallic ozone from the camera flashes and the faint, panicked sweat breaking out on Carol's brow. "Mrs. Preston, is it true you've been embezzling HOA funds?" a reporter shouted. "What about the illegal water deal with your husband's company?" yelled another. Carol's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, an ally, a hole to crawl into. But there was none. The faces of her neighbors, once a loyal army she could command with a withering glare, were now a jury, their expressions ranging from cold fury to open disgust. Her power had evaporated under the hot glare of the television lights. She tried to speak, to muster some of her old, imperious authority, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw not just hatred, but the terrifying, hollow emptiness of a queen whose kingdom had just been burned to the ground. David Chen, my lawyer, stepped calmly to my side. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had not only predicted every move his opponent would make, but had already planned the checkmate 10 steps in advance. "My client has no further comment at this time," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "However, we have provided a full package of evidence, including the documents you see here, sworn affidavits, and video evidence of criminal activity, to the district attorney's office. We expect they will be taking action very shortly." That was the final blow. The mention of the DA of an official criminal investigation sent a new shockwave through the room. Carol's husband, who had been lurking near the back, made a bolt for the door, but he was too slow. Mr. Henderson, the retired plumber with a 40-year-old grudge, stepped in his path, a solid, immovable object. "I don't think so, pal," he grumbled, his voice a low growl. "You've got some questions to answer." The meeting devolved into chaos. In the center of it all, Carol finally broke. She let out a shriek, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, and lunged toward me, her fingernails clawed like talons. "You ruined everything!" she screamed, her face contorted. Before she could reach me, two sheriff's deputies, who had been called by my reporter friend just minutes before the cameras went live, intercepted her. They each took an arm, their movements practiced and efficient. As they led her away, a sobbing, sputtering mess in handcuffs, she locked eyes with me one last time. "This isn't over," she hissed, the words of venomous promise. But we both knew it was. The game was up. Her reign of manufactured terror was finished. The days that followed were a blur. The story was on every local news channel, a sordid tale of suburban corruption, greed, and ultimately, justice. My face, the one from the water poisoner flyer, was now next to headlines that read, "Teacher exposes HOA scandal," and "Suburban Queen dethroned." My quiet life was over, but in its place was a profound sense of relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from my chest. The air in the neighborhood itself seemed to change. It felt lighter, cleaner. People started talking to each other again. They'd stop me on the street, not with looks of suspicion, but with smiles and words of thanks. Martha, the timid treasurer, became an unlikely hero, her quiet act of bravery inspiring others to come forward with their own stories of Carol's bullying and intimidation. The district attorney's investigation moved with a speed I never thought possible. Armed with Martha's financials, my meticulous log of harassment, and the crystal-clear, professionally enhanced video of Carol with the gas can, they built an ironclad case. Carol, her husband, and two of their cronies on the HOA board were charged with embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. But the biggest fish was yet to fall. The corrupt judge, the one with his signature on my eviction notice and his money, in the developer's illegal water deal, was implicated. His carefully constructed world of kickbacks and backroom deals came crashing down. The Judicial Review Board suspended him, and the DA announced that he, too, would face criminal charges. It was a complete and total takedown of a corrupt empire that had masqueraded as a homeowners association. About a month later, we held a new community meeting. Not in the sterile clubhouse, which was now considered a crime scene, but in my backyard, under the sprawling branches of the old oak tree that Carol had tried to destroy. The whole neighborhood was there. Kids played tag on my wild, unruly lawn, their laughter a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. The scent of barbecue smoke and freshly cut watermelon filled the air. It felt like a celebration, a declaration of independence. Mr. Henderson brought a cooler of beer, and Martha, no longer mousy and afraid, brought a homemade apple pie. During a lull in the conversation, a neighbor I barely knew asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "What happens now? How do we make sure someone like Carol can never take over again?" All eyes turned to me and then to David, who was enjoying a well-deserved burger. He wiped his mouth with a napkin and stood up. "That," he said, a familiar tactical gleam in his eye, "is the most important question." This was his final move, the one that would secure the victory for good. Most people think an HOA is a permanent fixture, like a law of nature. It's not. In this state, there's a statute that allows for the complete dissolution of a homeowners association. It's a drastic measure, reserved for cases where a board has breached its fiduciary duty, engaged in criminal activity, or ceased to function in the best interests of the community. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. I think we can all agree that our HOA has checked all of those boxes. To dissolve it, you need a vote. 75% of all homeowners. It's a high bar, but it's not impossible. It's a way for you, the homeowners, to take back your power, to wipe the slate clean and start over. It was the final knowledge bomb, the one that changed everything. It wasn't just about getting rid of Carol anymore. It was about getting rid of the system that had allowed her to flourish. The idea spread through the crowd like wildfire. Vote. A choice. The power to dismantle the very entity that had terrorized them for years. In that moment, a group of disparate, frightened homeowners became a community, united by a common purpose. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were citizens, ready to reclaim our rights. The vote was held 2 weeks later. The result was a landslide, 92% in favor of dissolution. The reign of the Oak Street HOA was officially over. We were free. The courtroom where Carol was sentenced was cold and imposing, the wood dark, the ceilings high. It smelled of floor polish and fear. It was the same courtroom from my eviction hearing, but this time the world had been turned right side up. I was in the gallery, watching. Carol was at the defendant's table, her expensive suit looking cheap and ill-fitting, her face pale and drawn. Her husband and the judge had already taken plea deals, their sentences lighter in exchange for testifying against her. But Carol, arrogant to the very end, had insisted on a trial. The jury had taken less than an hour to convict her on all counts. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman who had replaced the one Carol had bought, read the sentence in a clear, unwavering voice. For the crimes of aggravated arson, embezzlement, and fraud, she declared, this court sentences you to a term of no less than 20 years in a state penitentiary. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. 20 years. It was more than anyone had expected. As the bailiffs led her away, her confident smirk was finally gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. She was no longer the queen of the cul-de-sac. She was just another inmate, a number in a system that she could no longer manipulate. Justice, it turned out, was a fire that burned hotter than any she could have ever set. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright, clean afternoon. I thought back to that first letter, the one about the dandelions. It seemed like a lifetime ago, a different world. That passive-aggressive note on its cream-colored paper had been the spark, the tiny flame that had ultimately consumed Carol's entire corrupt world. I had learned a lot in the past year. I learned about the law, about the dark underbelly of my quiet suburban town. But the most important thing I learned was that one person, armed with the truth and a stubborn refusal to back down, can make a difference. That you don't have to be a lawyer or a politician to fight for what's right. Sometimes, all you need is a library card, a hidden camera, and a group of neighbors who have finally had enough. When I got home, I walked out to my front lawn. The dandelions were in full bloom, their cheerful yellow heads a defiant splash of color against the green. A few had gone to seed, their white, fluffy heads ready to cast their progeny to the wind. I remembered my husband telling me that dandelions were one of the most successful plants in the world because their seeds could travel for miles, taking root in the most unlikely of places. I picked one, held it up to my lips, and made a wish. A wish for quiet days, for good neighbors, for a world where people were more concerned with kindness than with conformity. Then I blew, and the seeds scattered. Tiny parachutes of hope dancing in the late afternoon sun, ready to plant a little bit of wild, untamable freedom wherever they landed. Your story could be next. Comment your HOA horror below, and I might cover it. If you believe no one is above the law, hit subscribe so we can take down every corrupt HOA together. Like, share, and tag a friend who needs to hear this. The more people know, the harder it is for HOAs to get away with this. To see another insane HOA takedown, click here. You won't believe what happened.